Good afternoon. I'm going to be speaking for the next 15 minutes or so on some forms of spectacles that may be less familiar and may indeed never become properly established. But I think there is a need which these new types of spectacles try and satisfy. And so I want just to start by saying that the very obvious things, that it's very easy to provide a presbyope with at least two pairs of single vision spectacles where the lens powers of one pair are suitable for distance vision and the lens powers in the other pair are suitable for reading, for near work. Of course, though, it's long been known that many people would like to be able to see distance and near through the same pair of spectacles. So, because spectacles are separate from the eye, unlike contact lenses, of course, you can rotate your eyes behind those spectacles, and looking through different regions of the area of the lens, you can have the appropriate power for distance at the top, the appropriate power for near, lower down, and so on. So you can have, as first recognized about the time of Franklin, bifocal spectacles, and of course since then a whole series of designs where different areas of the lens have different optical correcting power has been developed, trifocals, progressive lenses, and so on. The only problem with this, of course, is that if you want to look at a near object up here, say, and you've got a near bifocal segment down the bottom, you've got to be craning upwards and so on, that clearly you can only see through at a particular distance if you look through the appropriate area of the lens. And if we think of progressive lenses, then of course the areas devoted to near, intermediate and vision in particular are quite limited. If you stray out beyond those areas, as shown in the bottom of the right-hand side there, which shows cylindrical powers, much of the lens area, and I realize there are many different designs of multifocal lens, varifocal lens, but if you stray away from the narrow corridor which it's designed for, there's multiple problems in seeing clearly. So it seems to me at least, and it seems to various people over the last century at least, that there remains a need for spectacles with lenses which can be changed dynamically, which are so that if we want to look at distance, we want a full single vision lens of the appropriate power for distance. If we want to look at near, that same lens can change its power so that it's appropriate for near, and so on. That we would like lenses of variable power to be incorporated in our spectacles. Now, of course, many people, I hasten to say, are happy with the present range, but there's always this sort of ongoing feeling it ought to be possible to design a variable power spectacle lens. Now, the earliest device of this type was, as you might expect, how do you make a zoom lens for a camera? You use more than one lens. And if you look at the simple formula for separated lenses at the bottom right there, of course we know if we have two lenses of opposite powers and we separate them, we can get a combination of variable power. The only thing is, as is visible in the sort of pattern picture on the left-hand side, that this makes a pretty awful device to wear on your face. And clearly this isn't really a practical situation. Although we've got to remember that this is one of the devices, one of the approaches used in intraocular lenses. There's a design of intraocular lens called, I think, the Synchrony, which does have precisely this design and is intended as an accommodating intraocular lens to restore a measure, at least, of active accommodation. Now, I want to very briefly talk about three types of variable power lens that may establish themselves as practical devices for spectacles. On the other hand, it may be that experience shows that none of them work and the search goes on for this. Liquid-filled lenses, Alvarez lenses, and liquid crystal lenses. So let's have a look at these, and it's liquid-filled lenses that are the oldest design, and the essential thing here is that liquid is enclosed between two membranes, usually one rigid, the other flexible. If we pump in liquid, then the flexible membrane distorts, changes its surface curvature to change power. And on the left, you'll see something from 1912, more than 100 years old, where you have a fixed carrier lens, and then on its front, there's a deformable membrane, and liquid is pumped in and out. On the right is a slightly more superior design, which came out, I think, in the 1940s, which was quite practical. The problem with these lenses is obviously if you're pumping liquid around to change powers, perhaps there's going to be leakage, and this is a continuing problem. Nevertheless, there have been developments in recent years along these lines, and I don't know how many of you encountered this lens. There was a gentleman called Josh Silver who works at Oxford University, and he wanted to produce a pair of spectacles for third world use where instead of carrying an inventory of a whole series of different powers, you actually carried these liquid-filled lenses, and you adjusted them to suit the needs of the individual wearer in fairly primitive conditions. And you can see what this involves: a round-eyed frame with a pump on the side, and the idea was the wearer the wearer puts these on, adjusts a little pump at the side until they can see clearly at distance, if it's a distance correction, and then this is sealed off. This is just a fixed power lens. And this has been distributed in considerable quantities in Africa, and seems to fulfill at least some of the needs of wearers in that region, where there aren't, of course, professionals to measure refraction and so on in every case. Now, obviously, this would provide the basis of a variable power lens for presbyopes. This is just Silver in the bush and some of his lenses. But there has been a commercial development which is based on this principle, and this is the so-called superfocus spectacles, which actually I think I'm right in saying have come and gone, but it's an interesting sort of development along these lines in the sense that, as you can see, these consist of a variable power pair of spectacles as a variable near addition, if you like, but to take over the problem of how do you provide a distance correction, the correct distance and sphere is made up as a separate, sphere and sill is made up as a separate lens which can be attached according to the patient's needs appropriately to the frame containing the variable power elements. This was sold in some numbers a few years ago, at least in the United States, but again, the power was adjusted by a little lever on, as you can see, over the bridge of the spectacles, but again seemed to run into problems of leakage of the liquid. The liquid was not as stable as it should have been. But you can see that this is still an attractive design, and okay, there were limitations in that the lenses have to be circular in the simple form, and so the frames correspondingly, one can imagine ways over this. But as I say, this leakage problem remained. I was interested just before I came here, and I'm sorry to show this as an extra slide, but there was a publication just this last month on this same basis, and what we have here is a liquid crystal lens designed supposedly for spectacle use with a 30mm aperture, so quite reasonable, still in a prototype form, you'll appreciate. But I think you can see there are two surfaces enclosing the liquid. The lower surface is actually a transparent piston which can be driven small distance up or down. If it's driven up, it creates a convex surface with the flexible upper membrane. If it's driven down, it creates a concave surface to give negative power. And the drive of the piston comes from a bimetallic series of drivers around the periphery, which are electrically motivated to change the power. And what I liked about this was actually, this is the prototype lens looking not like a spectacle, I do agree, but you've got to remember this is a step along the way. But if you look at the bottom graph, this is the actuator voltage and the corresponding lens power, and you can see this device, which, as I say, is 30 millimeters aperture, so quite reasonable, and one can think it could be in some way incorporated in the spectacle frames, produces what, something like 5 or 6 diopters change in power. So there's continuing effort then in these liquid-filled lenses. Now, the second type of lens, which is achieving at least partial success in some quarters, is the Alvarez type of lens, named after its original inventor, where actually the lens consists of 2 closely spaced elements which are driven laterally with respect to one another. And the surfaces follow a cubic equation, and the thickness of the lens follows a cubic equation. And it turns out when you have slightly different forms of surface and drive these laterally, you can generate a lens of variable spherical power. And on the right-hand side, you'll see initially it has 0 power. It's a slightly wavy parallel plate. If you drive it outwards in the way it's arranged there, then you get the 2 components outwards, you get a converging lens. If you drive them inwards, you get a diverging lens. And these can be made up then into variable power spectacles. Now, the surprising thing, again, was that what recreated interest in these lenses was the desire to provide cheap third world corrections, and this actually is not intended for the Western world at all, but was a very cheap design intended for use in Africa and so on, where in fact this particular design I think was 0.5 to 4.25 diopters plus, and there was a corresponding diverging negative version to give correct myopia. There's been a lot of interest in improving these. I should just look at this. We've made some measurements on this, slightly imperfect measurements, but the top curve shows the power across the lens, the mean spherical power across the lens in 3 different power settings. And you can see that these are just arbitrary settings, that the lens +1 at the bottom, +2 roughly, +4 is pretty constant in power across the central zone. And if you measure the prism, you'd expect it to follow Prentice's rule, and the prism power should vary linearly across the lens, as indeed it does, as shown in the bottom of the slide. So these lenses work quite well. Actually, I've got a pair here which go 0 to 3 diopters. I'll put them on so that you can see they make me look virile and I think, was it exotic or erotic? I think I was told this morning by one of the speakers. But it has adjustments on either side here, and I can focus on here or on yourselves if I fiddle. These are actually, as designed at present, seem to be available with separate adjustment for each eye. One could imagine the mechanical drive being arranged to drive them both simultaneously, but clearly you can adjust for spherical power for an isometropes quite easily. The disadvantage of these lenses, very obviously, or these spectacles as made up, is how do we cope with people with different interpupillary distances, and also, of course, you've got continuously, if you want to move from distance to near, you've got to adjust it, and this isn't going to appeal to a lot of people. And I just wanted to show you down the bottom, still the cylinder power is very low. Obviously, if it's supposed to be a spherical lens, it shouldn't have cylinder power, and that is pretty low on these designs. The last type of lens is the liquid crystal type devices, and the idea here is that you have, rather like a liquid lens, 2 membranes containing liquid crystal, but you vary the refractive index by applying an electric field. And if the refractive index can be changed by applying a field, as we know can be done with liquid crystals, then you get a variable power. So basically these lenses have two surfaces, a space in which you put liquid crystals, and can be made up either in refractive form, Fresnel lens refractive form, or as a gradient index form, or indeed, as shown towards the bottom right, as a diffractive lens. And this is the diffractive one, where you only need to change the optical thickness by half a wavelength to create a diffractive lens. It's the most elegant solution, although perhaps technically the most difficult. I just wanted to show, just more or less to finish off, one commercial lens which made an appearance for a few years, the so-called M-Power by Pixel Optics. And this was actually a low-power, low-ad progressive lens in which there was a relatively small segment, so it doesn't fulfill my desire to have a full aperture variable power lens, but there was a liquid crystal insert which upped the power for near when you were looking downwards. A very sophisticated pair of spectacles were used where there was actually an accelerometer so that when you dropped your head to look down, it automatically turned on the X-rad power for near. Unfortunately, it turned out, although it was elegant, it was also very, very hard to make, and their production success really was so low that unfortunately they decided, I think, at the time that it could not continue in manufacture. I'm sure it will re-emerge in the future. So what we have then are at least steps along the way to what seems to me to be the ideal thing for presbyopes. That's, I want really to be able to look through the full aperture of the lens, look in any direction, I can see it near, then ideally, automatically, with some, maybe in the future, some ingenious rangefinder device, it changes its focus and I have full aperture, near vision, or whatever. And so we are moving along the way. Whether the ones that have been produced so far are going to be the final answer is very debatable. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if 10 years' time these were at least being used by some presbyopes in practice and being found useful by some. Maybe the geeks of this world, I don't know, can you translate geeks all right? Maybe the oddball people who like technology are going to be more interested than the majority. But it's going to appeal and be of value to some people. Well, thank you for listening.
Thank you.